Good evening. I am Byron Ballard, and I am going to tell you some stories tonight. Oh boy, I love telling ghost stories. So I hope you all have gotten yourself something to drink. I've got my special mug here, and you have your kitties on your laps, or you're holding your puppies. But either way, you are ready to get maybe a little chill. So, like most of you, and I know a lot of you, I am not going to be telling you the story that's a tale or a legend or some folklore. I'm going to tell you actual stories of actual ghosts that I or people that I know and trust, and there are very few of those. People that I know and trust and myself have had these genuine experiences with non corporeal energy beings. Isn't that a lovely way to put it? Ghosts. Now, when I was coming up, as some of you too, we just talked about this before we got started. When I was coming up, one of the things we loved to do, especially during the summer and in the fall, was to go outside and build a little fire somewhere in the yard or in the woods or out in a field. And we would tell each other ghost stories. And that was the point of the flashlight. It was kind of a standard that there would be nothing but the flames illuminating the circle. And then whoever was telling the story would hold the flashlight under their chin for extra power and scariness. But I don't necessarily want you to be scared tonight. I want you to think about the possibility, or as I believe, the probability, that there are beings who remain here on this plane with us following their decease. I've got several stories I want to tell you, and I'm going to be very mindful of the time. Those of you who know me know that I am prone to go down a rabbit hole and reappear somewhere else. So I'm going to do my best to stay on task. But if one of these stories reminds me of another juicy story, all bets are off. So the first one I want to talk about are ghost cats. Now, those of you who are cat people, and I know some of you are definitely cat people, some of you who are cat people have probably already experienced this. I'm going to tell you the story of the cat that came back. And I'm going to tell you another story then, a personal story about my own kitty who who was a bit of a stinker. So the cat who came back is the story that happened to a friend of mine, and she had an ancient cat, and he was enormous. He was black, as all great cats are. He was a big black Halloween sort of cat, and he had long fur and very bright green eyes. And over the years of his vast life, he lived to be, I think, 18 years old. He grew larger and larger and larger. And we all assumed that at some point he would simply morph into a panther and be done with it. But really, what happened is about the age of 16, he started getting smaller. As most of us do as we age, he got smaller and smaller and smaller. And he got slower and slower. And finally, this big, gorgeous, luxurious boy said his fond farewells to the people who loved him and the people that he loved. And he died at home, and he was buried with all of his proppers. We dug a hole in their garden, and we wrapped him in a beautiful cloth and kissed him goodbye. We did all of the things that you do when your beloved goes. Put him in, we put his grave goods on top, his favorite toys, his catnip, his special little bowl that he got treats in. All of those things went in with him in the sort of Egyptian sense that when he emerged in the other worlds, he would have with him all of the things that he loved and felt comfortable to him. Little did we know he wasn't going to the other worlds. He was staying right here. It was 7 days after his burial, maybe 8. And I got a call from my friend who said, um, the treat bowl is back. And I said, what? Pardon me? And the treat bowl, it was a little ceramic bowl, had reappeared in the kitchen. And she immediately thought something had been messing with the grave. So she went out to check, and no, there were still flowers and there was grass. We'd done a lovely job with the funerary arrangements, and nothing had been touched. But the bowl was back. And 3 or 4 days later, one of the toys appeared. It was the favorite toy, the one that had a feather on one end and a string on the other. And he used to play with that for hours and hours. She called me about that, and I went over to the house then, and I said, we're we're gonna have to open the grave and see what's going on. And she was like, no, 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 no. They said, are you sure? Because I will do it. You can stay in the house, have a cup of tea, and I will do that for you. And she said, no, no, I feel like that would be just desecrating it. And no, 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 let's not do that. I'm sure there's a logical explanation somewhere. So a week later, and now we are 2.5 weeks away from the cat's burial. And I really don't want to dig it up at this point. Another toy appeared. And with this toy, which was not the favorite toy, but with this toy, there was a tiny scrap of the beautiful fabric that we had wrapped his body in. And she freaked out. So I just came over, as you do for your friends. And there it was. It was absolutely a bitten off scrap of the fabric that this grand and luxurious boy cat had been buried in. And I made my offer again and said, well, is it time to at least scrape the dirt away and see what's going on? And she said, I really didn't want to do this, but I think I'm going to go crazy if we don't know what's going on. And I said, okay, do you want to help me or do you want to stay here? She stayed in the house, and I went out with a trowel because the soil was still very soft. And I scraped it away very gently, knowing that I didn't want to, dig deeply and really disturb the interment. So I scraped it away, and I got down to the cloth, the beautiful cloth. The toys were gone. The bowl was gone. And there was a tiny scrap that was bitten off the edge of the fabric. So I laid my hands on the bundle, and no, I'm not sure what I said. Something like, it's time for you to rest in peace. You need to stay here. She's okay without you. It's all going to be fine. And then I cut a bunch of fresh catnip and I put it on top of the bundle. And then I gently replaced all the soil. And with each bit of soil, I said aloud, she's okay. She's going to be okay. You need to go on to where you're going. Dun, dun, dun. I put the grass and the flowers and the herbs over the grave again. And I came back inside. And she was sitting there, very pale. And she was sitting in the way we all sit when there's a great big cat on our lap. And as I came closer and closer to her, I could hear the purring. So this continued for another 2 or 3 months. And I reassured her, I think, by saying, he has been with you for so long, and he's worried you're not going to be okay. So let him, if you are comfortable with it, let him be. And he will, sooner or later, move on. And that was, in fact, the case. He disappeared one dark moon, 3 or 4 months later. She was waiting to hear the purr, and she never did hear it again. But she kept the bowl and the toys, and we always put catnip on top of his grave to remind him that he was loved, but that his journey was elsewhere. So that's a true one. And then I'm going to tell you about my sweet boy. We had two young cats who moved in with us, and they were twin brothers. One was gray and one was black, and we named them Luca and Puka. So Luca was my daughter's favorite, and he, like the other cat I mentioned, had a very strong, loud purr. He got a terrible cancer when he was about 12 or 13 years old, and it took us a long time to have it diagnosed because our vet was really more used to dogs than cats. And so he went through a period of some discomfort. And I like to think he wasn't really in pain, but he was in some discomfort. And finally, we took him to a new vet who palpated his tummy and said, "Oh, I can tell you exactly what this is," and told us. And he said, and all of his internal organs are engaged at this point. So the kindest thing will be to have him put to sleep. And so my daughter and I were with him, and he went peacefully away, purring with his giant purr. We brought him home, and he lives in the front yard, or he lies in the front yard under the big rhododendron, which is where he always liked to sleep. And he came back. It was a month later, and all that came back was the purr. So we would hear this purr, and when you have a cat who's with you all the time, you get used to their particular purr because purrs are different depending on the kitty. And so we were so used to hearing his purr that we would come into the living room, which is where I am right now, and we would hear the purr coming from his favorite chair. And it was like, oh, he's very happy today. And then we'd be like, I'm glad he's happy, but he's dead. And we would go over and talk to the purr, and the purr would fade away. And that kept going for maybe about a month, I guess. And the incidences were less and less and less until we never heard him again. And I've not heard him since, really. But his brother was very lonely without him. And about a year and a half later, his brother got the same thing. He had the same very invasive cancer. And I heard him cough in the hallway. And I went out to see what was going on. And he looked at me, and I knew what he was saying to me was, I have the same thing my brother had. I do. It's okay. So we went to our new vet who did the palpating. Oh, what a good boy you are. And said, oh yeah, I'm going to do an x-ray, but I'm telling you it's the same thing. So he did an x-ray and came back, and he said, I think you should take him home with you tonight and have one more night of loving him up and hugging him and kissing him and all that stuff, and then bring him back tomorrow and we will take care of that. So that gave us the opportunity to do that, which is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful opportunity to have one last night with your buddy. So we took care of the euthanizing the following day, and again did him a beautiful burial with his propers, and he is under a stone slab right outside the gateway to my little garden. So every time I go into the garden, I go, hey, baby boy, how you doing? So he was not a big purrer, but he used to sleep with his feet behind me, and he would stretch over my neck like this with his head right here. So it was like wearing a fur collar all the time, and that's just how he liked to sleep, and I was mostly okay with that. So it wasn't the purr with him. I would feel him wrap around my neck at night, and I would wake up and go, oh, you're just having some dream or some hallucination. And I would feel him. He was still there. And again, that lasted for about a month, and then it faded away. And the whole time with him and with his brother, we would say things like, we love you so much, and you are just the best cat, but you have other work to do. You have other things to do in other worlds. So we're good. We're okay here. And you need to go on and do what you're doing. And I have found again and again with our non-corporeal friends that the very best thing is to let them know that you're okay, and to let them know that they're okay, but they have other places to be and other things to do. I do a lot of funerals, and I love to talk about to the bereaved people. I love to talk about how your beloved is now in the Summerlands or has gone into the West and is now learning to be an ancestor. So your beloved is a baby ancestor. And there's something about thinking that your 85-year-old grandma who had dementia and had a really hard end of life experience is now in this place where people are telling her how to be, and it is comforting to so many people to be able, whether they believe that or not, to be able to enter into the fantasy of that and to really fully engage it. So keep that in mind when you are experiencing a grief cycle yourself or standing by with someone who is also doing that. I don't often see spirits, but I get called out a lot from people who go, "Oh my gosh, there's a ghost in my house," or "I think I've got a poltergeist," or any number of things they've seen on TV or in the movies, and they're absolutely sure that's happening to them. And the secret is, most of the people who call me, the problem is them. It's not a spirit in the house. But sometimes it is. And I want to tell you a couple stories about that. So my friend she and her husband had bought an old farm out in the part of the county where I grew up. So I knew the area really well. And she wanted to have a big Halloween party in her barn, but she had this feeling, she had an intuition that there was a Confederate soldier who walked a line back and forth in this one particular place. And she had seen him out of the corner of her eye. And then she had had this intuitive knowing. So she asked me if I would just come out and see what I thought about it. Well, I explained to her, I don't often see ghosts, but I will come out and kind of feel the air and walk around and see what I get. So I did. So I met her at her house. We did the big hugs like we all do with each other. And aren't you looking forward to hugs again once we get on the other side of this? I am. So I gave her a big hug and I said, "Let me just wander around the barn." And the reason she wanted to know if it really was a spirit is because she wanted to rope that area off, because she didn't want people drinking and dancing and merrymaking if there was really a kind of trapped spirit. So she was being very respectful about the whole thing. So I go out and I do the thing that I call magic hands. So I rub my hands together, I get a lot of friction going, and then I just walk in concentric, narrowing circles until I feel something or I don't feel something. And sometimes I don't. So I walked and walked and walked, and then there was this one place, and it felt cold. It felt colder than the air around it, and it was a beautiful late summer day. So I tracked it to figure out what the line was of this coolness. And those of you who have done spirit work will know that it isn't just a cold line. Sometimes, if it's cool weather, it'll be a warm line. But either way, there is a barometric change and there's a temperature change that often lets us know that there is some spirit activity. So I tracked what the line was and I walked the line a few times and it felt very lively. I call it zizzy. It felt very zizzy. So I went back in and got my friend and I said, I want to show you this line that I've just walked. And you tell me whether that's where you've been experiencing this phenomenon. And I walked the line and she said, absolutely. I think that's what it is. And she said, do you get a feeling about who or what the spirit is? And I said, I honestly think that it's just a leftover imprint, that it was someone who was walking, pacing, and that imprint has remained even if the spirit has gone on. I said, I don't think it's anything you need to worry about. If I would rope the area off so that your party guests either don't freak out because they feel something weird or are disrespectful. She said, good, good. So we were just standing in front of her barn, talking about the land and looking at the view and talking about her party. And I looked back at her and looked up into the open door of the hayloft of the barn, and there was a young woman standing there. She looked to be 16, 17, late teenager, early adult. She had short bobby kind of brown hair and a blue dress that looked maybe late 30s, early 1940s. And she was standing there, leaning against the upright of the door of the hayloft, and she was gazing out towards the east in the same direction we had been looking, actually looking at the mountains and the city. And she just stood there and moved periodically. And I poked my friend and pointed, and I said, "Do you see that?" And she looked around and she said, "No, what is it?" And I said, "There's a young girl standing there. And if you don't see it, then we're going to assume that's a spirit person who is here visiting with us." So we watched her, and she paced a little bit. She walked to one side of the door and she walked back. She leaned against the door again. And at one point, she sat down and dangled her feet over the edge. And as we watched her, she slowly faded away, very slowly, until she was absolutely gone. It was a fascinating exercise in observation. But what happens to us when we have these phenomenon occur near us is that we want the story. And we never got the story of that one. In my head, I think she was a young girl waiting for her beau or her potential beau to return, maybe from the Second World War, because that the dress was about that time period. And she looked very sad and she looked very lonely. And of course, we assumed that he never ever came back. And so there is a part of her spirit that remains there, always watching for him to come up the road, up what then would have been a dirt road, and come home. There's so much about that kind of spirit work that's sad, isn't it? Where we encounter the grief of people that we maybe never knew. And we encounter that as a kind of solid emotional force. My mother swears she didn't get any of the family gifts that some of us got. My grandmother had precognitive dreaming, and her mother had hands on healing. And my mother said that she didn't get any of that stuff, that the witchcraft in our family skipped her generation. But she loved ghosts. So I think what her ability was the ability to see and interact with discarnate energy beings, with ghosts. So we would go. She was a homemaker, as they used to say. She didn't drive and she didn't work outside the home. And if she would hear of a ghost anywhere nearby, when my dad was home on the weekend, we would be loaded up into the old pink Cadillac, a pink station wagon, and drive to wherever that ghost was. And one of the ones that I remember that I encountered later on in my life was she had heard that there was a ghost of a young woman who walked across this particular place on the French Broad River. And then you saw her jump in. Well, we went there several times, and no sighting of said ghost was ever seen. But we heard more and more stories about it. So she was supposed to be seen to walk across the road. It's a 2-lane road, walk to the edge of the river, and then walk on stepping stones on the river to the middle of it, and then jump off at this low dam. Years later, I met some people at an Episcopal church there, across from where this phenomenon happened. And here is when I learned the backstory of that. So this was a private family chapel for a wealthy family. And if you go there today, there are 2 stained glass windows in this tiny, tiny church, 2 stained glass windows that were from Tiffany. So it's that beautiful glass, like those beautiful Tiffany lamps. And one of them is a doughboy, a soldier from World War One. And here's the story that goes with it. So the daughter of the household, when it was still a private chapel, was in love with a young man and was waiting for him to come home from France, where he had gone during the Great War, the war to end all wars, the war that really started all the wars of the 20th century. And so she waited and waited, and one day they got word that he had in fact been killed in France, and the body had not been recovered. And so he was gone. So she was, of course, wrapped and shattered in grief. And she also was shattered by the experience. So her father commissioned these two windows for the chapel so that anytime she needed to go in and pray and remember him, there was a beautiful window there. And she could sit and remember and remember. But what her father didn't reckon with was that the memories would be too much for her. And so one night, and we could think that maybe it was on his birthday, or maybe it was on the day that they had imagined they would marry, that she left the house in her nightgown, her long, white, flowing nightgown, and she walked down the steps from the chapel, and she walked across the road, and she walked onto the dam at the river. And in the center of the dam, she said her goodbyes, and she prayed, and she went to join her beloved by leaping into the river. So that way, two pieces of my life came together in one story, and I got to hear the backstory of the young woman who walked across the road and jumped into the river. I'm hoping one day that someone will tell me the story of the girl in the blue dress and how she waited and waited and waited for her beloved to come home, and he never did. When I was growing up, we had bought the house, my father had bought the house that I grew up in from some neighbors in that community. I grew up in a cove in West by God, Buncombe County. And the people that the elderly couple that he bought the property from continued to live in the neighborhood. So I don't remember all the details, but I can imagine that they were too old to live by themselves. And they went to live down the hill with one of their children. And that's where they were going to live out their days. Well, the man of the family who had built the house that we lived in and that I grew up in, he would come up and visit to check out the house. Oh, I think I saw a shingle that was off. Let me take a look at that and see if I can fix that for you. So he came around quite often, and he would come up this steep bank with steps in a very steep bank. He'd come up that, and then he would be a little winded because he was an older man who smoked, and he would wait at the top of the steps, catching his breath. And then he would have a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. And he would walk to the edge of the house, and my mother could smell the cigarette smoke. And he would cough, and sometimes he would spit. And he would put out his cigarette. Then he would walk to the front door, and he would peck on the door. That's how we say it around here. He'd peck on the door. And then he'd just open the door and come in because he felt it was his house. So that went on for a while, and my mother was very private, so I never asked her how she felt about him always showing up, but I think she was pretty gracious about it. And then several years later, a few years later, before I could even remember, he died. And so both of the old folks had gone. The The old woman had gone not long after they left the house, and he died a couple of years later. But here is the rub. For years after, he could be heard coming up the steps, pausing to catch his breath. You could smell cigarette smoke. You could hear him clear his throat. And the next thing you expected to hear was, but the knocking never came. It was only the walking, the breathing, the spitting, the coughing, and the smell of cigarette smoke. Several years back, for 2 years, I led a ghost tour of my downtown. Now, I am in Asheville, North Carolina, and I know the downtown very well. I had a studio there for many years, worked there for many years, and I live within walking distance still of downtown. So I know it well. And I had been given tickets to one of the official ghost tours, which is a big deal. We're a tourist town, so there's all sorts of things like that for people to do. So I was given a ticket to do the ghost tour, and it was supposed to be very, very good. So I'm excited. Oh boy, I'm going to hear the story of some of these ghosts that I know so well. And then the young woman leading the tour had a 3-ring binder with plastic sheets and the story in the pages in case she lost track of it. And we would come to spot number 1, and she would read the story of this thing that happened. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. I've never heard that story. And then there was another, and then we walked past a place that I knew for sure was haunted. And he said, are you not going to talk about this thing? Because this is a crazy ass thing. Whoa, if you don't know the story of this. And she said, no, tell me. So I told her that story because, I'm a country girl. I don't have any ulterior motives about things. So then we are still walking, and she passes by a couple of places that the stories were dubious. There might have been a ghost there. I'd never experienced that. So we get to one place that I know for sure is one of the creepiest places in town. And I went, you're not? And then I just went, don't tell nothing. You don't need to tell everybody everything you know. So I decided I was going to do my own ghost tour, and that's how this all got started. So for 2 years, I did this thing where I would take 13 people at $13 a head, and it was a 2-hour tour of downtown with all the trimmings. And I'd say, oh, and then this happened, and over here, this happened, and there used to be a whole block of buildings here. And let me tell you what happened there. So I had a wonderful time with that. And then on one of the tours, I was explaining about, it's an old cafeteria, a beautifully designed cafeteria that is often closed these days. It becomes a ballroom for a while, and for a while it was a bar, and it was different things, but it is not occupied for very long since it left its status as a cafeteria. And I was talking about this particular spirit that people have seen there often. And it is an African American man who's a waiter. And he's coming down the stairs in a beautiful white coat and black pants and shiny black shoes. And he has a tray. And you see him, and it's very pale, very translucent, but on a good night, when the moon is right and the street lights are good, you can see him walking down the steps. So I'm telling the story, and I'm being very and then I hear somebody behind me go, oh, you mean like this? And they turned their camera around, or their phone, I can't remember, but either way, small device, and they had somehow captured a photograph of this blurry image coming down the stairs. So I love to tell that one because it's right there. Building's right there. And then everyone went to peer in the glass like this to see if they could see anything on the stairs. It was wonderful. We have a ghost at our little farmhouse on Weird Mountain. Now, some of you may know that we have a podcast, and I have my alter ego, though I think it isn't so much an alter ego. I'm one of the Weird Mountain gals, and we've got a podcast, and we got some merchandise. We're doing all that kind of fun stuff. The merchandise I'm typing in is at Raven and Crone, which is a shop in Asheville. There we go. And there's a spirit there she's very sad. She's very sad. She was the renter in that house for a long, long time. The house belonged to my grandmother, and she had planned to retire there because at the time when she bought it, which was in the 1960s, it was still in the country. It was before Asheville started expanding and annexing the parts of the county around it. So it was a little country house, and it looks like that. It's a little grandma house. And then my grandfather, who was in his 80s, got Alzheimer's, and he couldn't be moved. It would have messed him up too much. So she decided to keep renting the house to the woman who'd been renting it for many years. And as it turned out, was the woman that the house had been built for back in the 1940s. So she, after many years, she was too unstable, both emotionally and physically, to live alone. And one of her daughters convinced her to come and move in with her. And that worked for a few years, but her physical state and her mental state deteriorated until she ended up going into a facility. And we were all very sad about all of that. But at the point where she had to move in with her daughter, my grandmother said to me, I don't want to rent the house out anymore. I'm going to give that to you as your inheritance, and you can deal with it. So rent it out, don't rent it out, it'll be fine. So we're in the process of making that a farm and a mini retreat center so that you all can come and study with me once that's all done. And we'll work on farming and beekeeping together. It'd be fun, I think. So I was in the house because our coven used to meet there years ago, and we had a big coven. We would meet on Saturday nights. And I remember there was one Saturday where I was very restless, and it was late, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was lying in bed, and from the corner of the room, from the corner of the bedroom, up high behind the door, I heard a voice distinctly say, "At last, at last." I didn't go back to sleep. I listened to see if there was going to be any more talking. And of course, you all know what happens. The rest of the story is that, in fact, she had died that day in the nursing home. And she had come back to the house that she loved, where she had raised her children, at last. Now, we are still there on Weird Mountain. We have guests there. Some of you will know people who have been guests in the house on Weird Mountain, the farmhouse. And she, our friendly neighborhood granny ghost, leaves us pennies and sometimes shiny dimes, but mostly pennies. And yes, it could be that we just have leaky pockets and the pennies fall out. But I swear to you, I cleaned the bedroom. I swept the floor. I mopped the floor, and I was going back in to check to see if the floor was dry, and there was a penny in the middle of the floor. Now, I'd already swept and I'd already mopped, and that penny was not there. And it was not on any surface that it could have fallen down. And she does that all the time. In fact, we have jars all over the house where we collect the money that she drops and leaves for us. And we smell her sometimes, and she smells like old powder and fried onions. But she is kind and gentle, and we love her. And we leave her little offerings of drink. I don't know that she ever did drink, but we leave her things like sweet sherry and cordials and aperitifs because they're so sweet, and she did have a sweet tooth. And I think I've got time for another couple of stories. So I want to tell you about Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown was the ghost that lived in my grandmother's other house, in the house where she lived. And we grew up on stories of how Mrs. Brown had died and she had fallen down the steps from the second floor. Boom, 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 boom. She had hit the ground, hit the first floor on that hard hardwood floor, broken her hip. She had been carried into the back bedroom, which was my room. She had been carried back into the back bedroom where she had died days later. That's the story. It was also believed that Mrs. Brown hated men. So when my grandmother first bought the house, my father would come on the weekends and help her do things like painting and replacing windows, things like that. My grandmother was quite the carpenter. And he found that every time he pulled into the driveway, he got a nail in his tire. I got a flat tire. And it irritated him. It pissed him off. So he decided what he would do is he would always park on the street and not park in the driveway at all. And then he was fine from there on out. But that began the legend that Mrs. Brown hated men. And we never knew why specifically she might have hated men. Perhaps a man had pushed her down the stairs to her death all those years before. We also know that in that back bedroom where she allegedly died, my great uncle Carl, who lived in New York and had come down to visit his baby sister, he was sleeping in one of the beds in the back bedroom. And leaning up against the back of the bed, he was facing a fireplace. And on top of the fireplace was a pair of milk glass vases with beautiful blue artificial flowers in them. Does that set it for you in the late 60s? It did for me too. There was a mirror behind it. There were other little tchotchkes on the mantle. But my Uncle Carl was sitting reading in bed with the light behind him, and he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye, and he looked up and he saw the vase levitate from the top of the mantle and fly directly towards him and smash against the wall beside his head. Because Mrs. Brown didn't like men. Now, here's the real truth about all of that. Genealogy has ruined so much of ghost hunting, hasn't it? We found out there never was a Mrs. Brown, not at that house. There was a Mr. Brown, but he didn't die there. So whatever that phenomenon was that we had embraced as our house spirit, we'd given it the wrong name and we'd given it a different story. But we embraced it as a member of the household, a trickster member of the household to be sure, but a member of the household nonetheless. All right, one more story. So I was called to a house somewhere in town, and the person who asked me to come said, I think we have a ghost. And I was like, yeah, sure you do, whatever. So I did the same thing I'd done at the little farm. I went to the house, and he was telling me about the different phenomenon that he had experienced. And I went upstairs and I said, there's a cool band here. Do you experience her here? Yes, I do. We go into the doorway and into the room where the band ended, and the whole room is just a little bit cooler than the rest of the house. There's no logical reason for that, but it's a little cooler. And I said, phenomenon in here. Yes, indeed, phenomenon in here. So we go through the house and I tell him the different spots and the different things I'm feeling and sensing and the different intuitive stuff. And we go downstairs to sit at his kitchen table and we have coffee. And he was laughing. He said, "Oh, no, don't sit in that chair. That's her chair." I was like, "Oh, cool. Okay." He said, "No, every morning she comes down the stairs. I hear her come down the stairs and she sits in that chair and I pour her a cup of coffee." And I said, "Well, God, that is so sweet. I just love that." And then I finally got around to saying, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" And he said, "Do?" And I said, "Yeah, I mean, do you want me to send her home, to send her on, or?" And he said, "No, gosh, no. I mean, it's her house. I'm just renting." And I loved him forever for that. So she is still there, I hope, in her house, coming down the stairs, maybe having coffee with the new tenants. I hope so. I hope she's doing that. We have a few more minutes, so I'm going to see, does anybody have questions? And if you don't have questions, I may have one more story to tell you. Anything?
I guess one more story. We're loving to hear. We love hearing what
Yep,
you say.
that's what Angela's saying. One more story.
Yep.
Let me think of the best one. Hmm. I live in the same neighborhood that my great grandparents moved into at the end of the 19th century. They moved from the adjoining county, so they didn't move very far. But they came here and they had a little grocery store. And I grew up with stories. The grocery store was torn down during urban renewal and they had long moved away. But I grew up with stories of the ghosts in this particular neighborhood, which is an old mill village. There was a denim mill, a cotton mill, and there's a hatchery. There were several. It's the industrial belt of the city. So I grew up with lots of stories of the ghosts in this area. One of them that I am particularly fond of is the sleeping man. So there was in this grocery store, the grocery store was on the first floor, of course, and the family lived on the second floor. It was a big family, whole bunch of girls, couple of handful of boys, 3 boys, and ranging in a very broad range of ages. And my great grandmother kept this store, and there's lots of stories about that store that someday I think I'll write into a book. But what you need to know is that there was a couch on the landing of the stairs going up to the second floor. And the couch had been there as long as anyone could remember. And it was one of those old, stuffed with horsehair sort of couches that was pretty rough. And it might have been moved out of the upstairs parlor, maybe on its way to go out and go out onto the street so somebody could pick it up. And it just never got very far. Our family's not known for finishing up their tasks in any kind of speedy order. So it stayed there for a long, long time. And when the street light was at a particular angle and there were clouds across the moon, you could see the shape of a man sleeping on the couch. And he had his back to the viewer and he had his arm under his head and his knees were drawn up so that you could see the bottoms of his shoes. And they were worn. They were very worn. And I've always thought that he might have been a salesman who traveled all through the Southeast because there was a railroad depot just a few blocks away. And I could imagine that my great grandmother, who was always short of cash, might have she might have rented out a room to a tired traveler. And it may be he slept on that couch and he never woke up. And so he stayed in that place with a little bit of light and a comfortable, if lumpy, couch where people cared about him and gave him a nice meal. And so he stayed there, I'm sure, until they tore the place down. And he might still be there, because if it was a ghost of a man, he could be a ghost of a man sleeping on a ghost of a couch. There on the landing to the second floor in a ghost of a building, forever resting from his labors and his wanderings, resting in comfort and something like peace. Thank you all so much. It was fun telling you stories.
Thank you, Byron.